There may be something fundamentally wrong with the calendar we live by. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I'm not talking about a vague feeling that time moves too quickly, or the modern complaint that life feels rushed. I mean something far more concrete, something structural, mathematical, and surprisingly, visible once you begin to look closely. The calendar that governs almost every aspect of modern civilization. The Gregorian calendar is strangely irregular. Look at it carefully. Some months have 31 days. Others have 30. February has 28 days most of the time. Except when it suddenly has 2 9-weeks do not divide evenly into months. Months do not divide evenly into the year. Quarters used in finance and government reporting rarely line up neatly. It's a system so inconsistent that most people rely on apps, reminders, or printed calendars just to navigate it. Children memorize the lengths of months using tricks with their knuckles. Adults constantly check their phones, yet we rarely stop to ask a simple question. Why is the system so chaotic in the first place? If you were designing a calendar from scratch, one meant to organize the lives of billions of people, you would probably choose something simple, regular, and easy to follow. But the Gregorian calendar isn't simple. It feels patched together. And the deeper researchers have looked into the history of calendars, the more another possibility begins to emerge. What if the irregularity is not accidental? What if time was once organized very differently? There is, in fact, an alternative calendar model that has fascinated historians, astronomers, and reformers for more than a century. It is astonishingly simple. 13 months, 28 days in each month, 13 times 28, 364 days, exactly 52 weeks, exactly 4 perfect weeks per month. Every month begins on the same weekday. Every year, then one additional day, a special day outside the monthly cycle, completes the solar year at 365 amperes. Day of transition, a day belonging to no week and no month. Ancient cultures often treated such days as sacred. Once you see the structure, something strange happens. The system feels natural, elegant, almost obvious. And the more researchers examined ancient timekeeping traditions, the more unsettling the pattern became, because versions of this 28-day rhythm appear again and again across civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other. The Maya. Ancient Egypt. Pre-Roman Britain. Indigenous cultures of North America, different continents, different millennia, yet the rhythm keeps appearing. 13 cycles, 28 days. Which raises a question few people ever ask. If this pattern was so widespread, why don't we use it today? The deeper you follow this trail, the stranger the pattern becomes, because the number 28 doesn't only appear in ancient calendars. It appears inside the human body. The average menstrual cycle lasts about 28 days, repeating roughly 13 times in a solar year. This is not mythology or symbolic interpretation, it's biology. Long before written calendars existed, the human body was already moving in a repeating monthly rhythm. And then there is the moon. The moon's sidereal orbit, the time it takes to return to the same position among the stars, lasts about 27.3 days. The more familiar synodic cycle, the phase cycle from full moon to full moon, averages about 29.5 days. Right in between these two natural cycles sits the 28-day rhythm, almost perfectly centered. For some researchers, that coincidence is difficult to ignore. It suggests that ancient observers may have built their systems of timekeeping not from politics or convenience, but from long-term observation of the sky and the body itself. In other words, time may once have been measured by nature first, which makes the modern calendar feel even stranger. Look at the names of the months we use today. July is named after Julius Caesar. August is named after Augustus Caesar. Historical records show that the lengths of these months were adjusted during the Roman reforms. Days were shifted from one month to another so that the emperor's month would not appear shorter than another ruler's. In other words, part of the calendar was literally political branding that leads to an uncomfortable Question: when exactly did the measurement of time become a political decision? Historians usually point to the Roman world. Before Roman expansion, many cultures used lunar or lunar solar calendars tied to agricultural cycles, seasonal observations, and the movements of celestial bodies. But when Rome expanded across Europe and the Mediterranean, the Julian calendar became the official system of administration. Local timekeeping traditions did not simply fade away. In many cases, they were actively suppressed. For example, the Druids of Celtic Europe maintained complex lunar calendars used for ritual and agricultural planning. Roman authorities viewed these systems as obstacles to centralized control. Over time, Druidic traditions were criminalized and gradually erased. Centuries later, another reform occurred. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar to correct inaccuracies in the Julian system. The reform required a dramatic adjustment. Several days were simply removed from the calendar to realign it with the solar year. In some regions, people went to sleep on one date and woke up more than a week later. Entire days disappeared from the record. For historians, these transitions were technical corrections. But when you step back and look at the pattern, something else becomes visible again and again. Systems that aligned human life with natural cycles were replaced by systems aligned with administration, taxation, and state authority. And yet the most surprising part of the story doesn't lie in ancient history. It happened much more recently. In the early 20th century, a serious international movement tried to change the calendar of the entire world. The movement began with a man most people have never heard of, Moses B. Cotsworth, a British statistician working in the early 1900s. While analyzing financial records for railway companies, Cotsworth noticed a persistent problem. Months had different lengths, quarters were uneven, and comparing data from one year to another was unnecessarily complicated. The deeper he studied the issue, the clearer the solution seemed. In 1902, Cotsworth proposed what he called the International Fixed Calendar. Its structure was strikingly simple: 13 months, each containing 28 days. Every month would have exactly 4 weeks. Every year would contain 364 days, forming 52 perfect weeks. To complete the solar year, one additional day would be added outside the normal weekly cycle, a special transition day that belonged to no month and no week. In leap years, another similar day would be inserted. The result was a calendar of remarkable consistency. The first day of every month would always fall on the same weekday. January 1st would always be Sunday. March 1st would always be Sunday. December 1st would always be Sunday. Schedules would never shift. Holidays would never move. Financial quarters would be perfectly equal. So TSW, or to even propose the name of the extra month, Sol, it would sit between June and July, positioned at the height of summer in the northern hemisphere. At first glance, the idea sounded radical. But once economists and industrial leaders examined it, many realized how practical it actually was. One of the most powerful supporters soon appeared: George Eastman. The founder of Kodak, Eastman was not known for indulging eccentric ideas. He was a businessman obsessed with efficiency and standardization. After reviewing the proposal, he decided to adopt the International Fixed Calendar inside the Kodak company itself. In 1928, Kodak officially switched to the new calendar for internal operations. And something interesting happened. According to company records, accounting became simpler. Scheduling became clearer. Administrative errors decreased. The regularity of the system made long-term planning easier for departments across the company. For more than 6 decades, Kodak quietly ran its internal operations. Using this alternative calendar, Eastman became one of the strongest advocates for global calendar reform. He funded research, testified before committees, and pushed for international adoption. The proposal even reached the highest levels of global governance. During the 1920s, the League of Nations began formally studying calendar reform. Committees were established to evaluate proposals from around the world. Governments, businesses, and academic institutions submitted hundreds of ideas, among them the International Fixed Calendar. quickly emerged as one of the most serious contenders. Momentum was building for a brief moment in history. It seemed entirely possible that the world might soon adopt a 13-month calendar, but then something strange happened. The discussions slowed. Committees stopped meeting, reports were summarized but never finalized. And by the mid-1930s, the entire movement had quietly faded away. No dramatic vote. No decisive rejection. Just silence. As if the idea had simply evaporated. Yet the reasons for that disappearance are far more complicated than they first appear. At first glance, the failure of calendar reform seems easy to explain. Large global systems are difficult to change. Governments resist disruption. Traditions are powerful. But the deeper researchers looked into the debates of the 1920s and 1930s, the more puzzling the situation became, because the international fixed calendar was not dismissed as impractical, even. Many critics admitted that mathematically and administratively it worked better than the Gregorian system. Businesses liked the stability. Economists appreciated the clarity of equal quarters. Planners saw advantages in predictable scheduling. So if the system worked, and if influential figures supported it, why did the reform collapse so quietly? Some historians suggest that the resistance came primarily from religious institutions. A fixed calendar would occasionally interrupt the traditional 7-day religious cycle because the extra transition day would not belong to any week. For many religious authorities, this disruption of the continuous Sabbath cycle was unacceptable, but that explanation alone doesn't seem to account for the full picture. Another factor may have been institutional inertia. By the early 20th century, the Gregorian calendar was deeply embedded in legal systems, international trade, banking structures, and government administration. Changing it would require rewriting contracts, adjusting fiscal systems, and retraining entire bureaucracies. Yet, even that still leaves an uncomfortable question: if societies regularly adapt to new technologies, currencies, and political systems, why would a mathematically superior calendar be considered too disruptive? Some analysts point to something less obvious. Complexity itself can create dependence. Irregular months lead to irregular accounting. Businesses must constantly adjust reports to account for months of different lengths. Quarters vary slightly each year. Financial comparisons require corrections and interpretation. In a perfectly regular calendar, many of these adjustments would disappear. Reports would align naturally. Data would be easier to compare. Planning cycles would become more transparent. In other words, time itself would become simpler, and whenever systems become simpler, certain professions lose their importance. Layers of administrative interpretation become unnecessary. This doesn't mean there was a hidden conspiracy to block reform, but it does suggest that power structures often adapt to complexity, and complexity can quietly protect existing systems. Meanwhile, outside the world of economics and politics, another question continued to echo among historians and archaeologists. Why had so many ancient cultures independently developed time systems closely related to the 28-day cycle? Stone circles across Britain appear aligned with lunar observations that repeat in roughly 28-day patterns. Some researchers believe the famous 56 Olbury holes at Stonehenge may have been used to track lunar cycles. Two sets of 2/8. Ancient Mesoamerican calendars often used repeating cycles involving the number 13, which appears again and again in their timekeeping systems. The Egyptian civil calendar used 12 months of 30 days plus 5 extra days considered outside normal time. A structure that strangely echoes the concept of days outside the calendar. Count across different civilizations. The same numerical patterns keep appearing. 13 cycles, 28 days, extra transitional days. Of course, these similarities do not prove that all ancient cultures used the exact same calendar, but they do suggest that many early observers of the sky were paying close attention to natural rhythms, the moon, the stars, and seasonal patterns, and perhaps that is the most interesting part of the entire story for most of human history. Time was not primarily defined by governments or institutions. It was defined by the sky. When time was first measured by human societies, it was not created inside government offices or written into bureaucratic law. It was observed. People looked up. They watched the moon grow and shrink, disappear and return. They watched certain stars rise in the same place every year. They noticed that the body, the tides, the migrations of animals, and the changing light of the seasons all followed repeating patterns. Time, in that world, was not something abstract. It was something felt. A hunter knew the season by the wind and the sky. Farmers understood planting cycles by the moon and the length of the day. Ceremonies and festivals were synchronized with celestial events that anyone could observe without needing a clock. In many indigenous cultures that maintained lunar-based calendars well into the modern era, anthropologists documented something difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. People seem to experience time differently. Not slower exactly, but less fragmented. Instead of constantly checking devices or consulting schedules, time existed as a rhythm people lived inside. The cycle of work, rest, celebration, and preparation flowed in harmony with visible natural patterns. Modern chronobiology, the science that studies biological time, has begun to explore something similar. Researchers have found that human sleep cycles, hormone production, cognitive performance, and emotional stability are all strongly influenced by alignment with natural light and biological rhythms. When those rhythms are disrupted by artificial schedules, irregular sleep patterns, or constant clock pressure, the body experiences measurable stress. Of course, this doesn't mean that adopting a 30-month calendar would magically transform modern life. Societies today are complex, interconnected, and dependent on systems that require precise coordination, but it does raise a fascinating question. What happens when human civilization gradually shifts from observing natural cycles to imposing artificial ones? At some point in history, the authority to define time moved away from the sky and into institutions, kings, governments, religious authorities, and later international standards. When the Julian calendar spread through the Roman Empire, it replaced many local timekeeping traditions. Later, when the Gregorian reform of 1582 was introduced, entire countries suddenly skipped days in order to realign their calendars. In some places, people went to sleep on one date and woke up on another. 11 days simply disappeared from the official record. Time itself had been administratively corrected. Centuries later, reformers like Moses B. Cotsworth attempted to rebuild a more symmetrical calendar system, one that echoed the elegance of older lunar rhythms. Industrialists like George Eastman even proved that such a system could work in modern corporate environments, yet the reform never spread globally. The Gregorian calendar remained. Perhaps the reason is simple. Changing the system that organizes global time is extraordinarily difficult. The world had already synchronized around one structure, and replacing it would require enormous coordination. Or perhaps something else is happening, something quieter and more gradual. Over time, societies become accustomed to the systems they inherit. What once seemed strange eventually felt normal. Complexity becomes routine. Irregularity becomes invisible. A broken rhythm, repeated long enough, begins to feel like the only rhythm that ever exists. And that may be the most intriguing question left by this entire story. Not whether the 13-month calendar was perfect, not whether the calendar is flawed, but whether there were once other ways of understanding time, ways rooted more deeply in the relationship between the sky, the body, and the natural world that slowly faded from collective memory. Because history shows that knowledge is rarely erased in a single dramatic moment. More often, it disappears quietly, replaced piece by piece, generation by generation, until the original system is no longer remembered as an alternative, only as a forgotten possibility. And if something as fundamental as the structure of the calendar could change so completely over time, it leaves us with one final thought. What other systems around us might feel permanent today, simply because we have never been told that another rhythm once existed?